All right, so welcome to sort of our roots of the Cold War discussion for today. The general idea is that we're going to start with the end of World War II and take us all the way up and through uh, the start of the Korean War, which is what we'll talk a little bit more about on Wednesday in our session together then. Just a couple quick remarks regarding the Cold War. First of all, the Cold War is really it's more of an ideological conflict. It's different than traditional war, where you have clearly defined and delineated battle lines. You have certain fronts and places where there's fighting and things like that. We can definitely pinpoint some places where there's some intense disagreement on the Cold War, but in terms of having actual battles, the reason that it's called the Cold War, and we'll get into this at the end of the lecture here today, the reason it's called the Cold War is that the two main combatants, the United States and the Soviet Union, never actually come to meet each other on the battlefield. It's ideological. It's really more of a war of ideas. The second thing is that because of that, you're talking about a very large scope of history. We're just going to hit on the very beginnings of the Cold War. This is something that's going to continue to pop up. Here in the next 5 weeks, we're eventually going to get to the 1960s in Vietnam, right? Vietnam also has Cold War subtexts to it. Once we get past Vietnam, we're going to talk about Reagan, Carter and Ford and Reagan, not to mention Nixon, and those four presidents who are really, modern presidents, they all had to deal with the Cold War. So this is something that does not go away, and it's not going to go away for quite some time. But it's important to understand the backdrop of that. Why are we continuing to worry about the Soviet Union? And that really becomes something that people in the United States start to question, especially along about the 1960s. Third and finally, we're not going to hit everything. Obviously, I wish that we could, but there's just no way to hit everything with regard to even the beginnings of the Cold War. So obviously, we're not going to get through the whole thing in our time together here today, or really overall for the length and the breadth of the course, let alone whatever time we have through distance learning. So with that being said, we're going to go to some notes. Now, in terms of notes that you need to be taking, I've already told you, and I've already kind of let the cat out of the bag that you are going to have a 3-2-1 assignment where you're going to need to tell me three things that you learned, two things that surprised you in a question. I would ask that you make sure and watch the whole. I would ask that you watch the whole lecture. Somewhere towards the end, there's going to be something that I ask you to make sure and that you talk about in your 3-2-1, and that will tell me as to whether or not you've watched the entirety of the lecture. So please make sure that you watch the whole thing, because otherwise it's going to be pretty obvious. Because as soon as I go to look at what you've written, if I don't see that one particular subject that I asked you to write about in there in some form, then I'm going to know that you probably didn't watch the whole thing. And just as a reminder on that, and this will be in the instructions for that assignment, because this is sort of your one assignment for this section of material, I do ask that it be fairly well developed. I want for each of the three things that you learn, 2 to 3 sentences for each. For each thing that surprised you, I want 2 to 3 sentences for each. Right now, the question is obviously a one-off. That's one question. You don't need any background information there. But for those first two components, I definitely do want to see 2 to 3 sentences for each. Okay. So with that being said, let's go ahead and dive into the Cold War. So again, we're going to start with World War II is over, and things are a little bit awkward after World War II is over because, again, the alliance with the Soviet Union was really an alliance, not really of convenience, but it was sort of a choice between the lesser of two evils, right? Especially Britain. They hate the Soviet Union. They hate communism. And that's an ideological conflict that goes back 100, at least 100, 150 years or so. So again, we don't have a lot of time to get into that. We just need to hit on some of the basics here. Now, I've got some things here in bold. That's really more for me, things that I need to make sure and hit on. But we do need to start with the figure of Joseph Stalin. Excuse me. And this is that first point is again just sort of driving home the point that our alliance with Stalin and with the Soviets was really an alliance of convenience more than anything else. And once Hitler and the Nazi sort of political regime there in Germany was taken care of, communism becomes sort of the target again. It becomes the enemy. Stalin is not a good guy. I can almost hear Cole, almost 4 or 5 days out in advance, hearing this, and watching this lecture and his disdain for Stalin. And I know that goes ideologically, with regards to communism. But for our purposes here, Stalin is a dictator who slaughters just as many, if not more people than Hitler did. If you look at the raw numbers, Stalin's not a good guy. But that being said, Roosevelt, FDR, has really a pretty good working relationship with Stalin. It's not great, but it's certainly better than the relationship that Truman is going to have. Now, that being said, obviously, Roosevelt doesn't necessarily like the guy. He can work with him. One of the big sticking points, for example, is even though they have a good working relationship, it's not like Roosevelt's going to tell him that we have the atomic bomb. And that actually becomes one of the really big sticking points really early on with the Soviet Union and the United States is you guys had this weapon that ended the war in Japan. Why didn't you tell us about it? Well, we're not going to tell you everything. But again, even though it was Roosevelt that sort of kept that from Stalin, because Truman is the one that makes the decision to drop the bomb, it really comes back on Truman with regard to Stalin. All right. Now, after World War II, really all of Europe, but especially Eastern Europe, is totally destroyed. Stalin, he promises in the wake of World War II, all these smaller countries that are created in the wake of World War II, look, they're going to be allowed to have free elections. They're going to get to choose their government, elected assemblies, the whole 9 yards. And then he backs out and basically forces all of them into sort of a satellite state relationship with the Soviet Union, which is to say, essentially, they're not territories of the Soviet Union. The Soviets are not stepping in directly and telling them exactly what to do. But it's kind of one of those implied things, like, if you guys know what's good for you, you'll do things the way that we want you to do them. This causes a lot of anxiety, especially from the British and the U.S. For a couple reasons. One, again, the British especially, but Americans even, they don't necessarily like the Soviets. They don't like this idea of communism. But secondly, this sort of harkens back to Hitler, where Hitler would make a promise and then go back on it, and then make a promise and then go back on it. And that made a lot of people very uneasy and caused a lot of anxiety. And that point again, I'm going to drive this home, is that Truman is incredibly untrusting of Stalin. He thinks Stalin is this huge threat, and we'll get into maybe why here in a minute, right? Now, among a lot of the situations that we're going to talk about today, the one that is probably the most awkward, but also perhaps the most avoidable, if there's any of this that was able to be avoided, was sort of the awkward situation in Germany. So after the war, we decide, we the Allies, and you can see them there, the British, the French. I believe that's the Netherlands down there in the bottom. Let me see if I can get my cursor. See if I can get a little there we go. I think that's the Netherlands. I'm not entirely sure, though. Please don't quote me on that. And now I can't. There we go. But especially the big fours: Britain, France, the United States, and then the Soviet Union. We decide we're going to divide Germany up. Okay, and this is not uncommon um, in terms of war and the spoils of war. You divide a country up, and in this case especially, we would divide the country up. We would divide Germany up so that they would never become powerful enough again to pose a threat to sort of the world order the way that they did. And the way that we divide it up, you can kind of see it there in the map, is the British get the zone that's in green, the U.S. gets the zone that's in yellow, France gets this zone that's in blue, and then the Soviets get this zone that's in red. And a lot of this makes a ton of strategic sense, especially the French and the British. Those are sort of the areas that are closest to those countries geographically. The same way with the Soviet Union. The U.S. obviously is just sort of the outlier. The problem, though, is that we also divide Berlin in much the same way. Now, you may be thinking to yourself, well, why would we pick this one city to divide up in this particular fashion? And the reason is, of course, is that Berlin is the capital of Germany. I have taken to drinking tea. Excuse me, I've taken to drinking tea during our little hiatus here. I don't know what that says about me. Anyway, it's the capital, so it's the most powerful city in Germany, right? So everybody kind of wants a little piece of that pie. The problem is not that we divide the city up. The problem is the location of the city itself. It is right smack dab in the middle of the Soviet-controlled eastern portion of Germany. So why is this a problem down the road? Well, because quite frankly, if you are in the French, the British, or the American-controlled side of Berlin, what becomes known as West Berlin, you are really at the mercy of the Soviets because you're literally surrounded on all sides, by land that is controlled by the Soviet Union. So this is really, really awkward. And we're going to see here in just a minute that it becomes a problem for everybody really pretty quickly. Now, we have to deal a little bit with communist expansion, and we're not going to take a lot of time here. We just need to note that the countries that are in red, the deep red, the lighter red, or like that tannish color, those are states that sort of fall under the Soviet sphere of influence. In other words, those are places that again, like I talked about earlier, and you can see sort of those Eastern European nations that I can just sort of draw in red. Those Eastern European nations, for example. These are not places that are directly under the control of the Soviet Union, but they're influenced by them, right? If they are not communist in the beginning, they certainly will be communist very quickly. And this is a little dicey, right? The United States, the British, the French, we have countries in our sphere of influence as well, right? The worry, though, and the hand wringing comes in the countries that fall under our sphere of influence geographically and population-wise are nowhere near as large as some of the countries that we're talking about here, especially the Soviet Union to begin with, but especially then China, right? So that also adds to a lot of this anxiety. Now, in terms of part of the reason why, and to be sure, Truman didn't trust Stalin to begin with, but this certainly didn't help. You have this guy, Winston Churchill. I guess I can circle him real quick here. Winston Churchill is the former prime minister of Great Britain. And what he does is he comes to the United States and he takes a tour. And while he's on this tour, he gives a speech at this college in Missouri, which happens to be Truman's home state, right? And he says this quote here that says, "An iron curtain has descended across the continent." And the continent he's talking about is Europe. And you can see this right here, right? We blow this picture up. I'm going to make it large enough to where I can shrink it back down. I apologize, it is a little blurry, but you can see the iron curtain, right? Everything that's on the left side is democratically controlled. Everything that's on the right-hand side of the line is communist controlled or is under a dictatorship, right? And to Churchill, rather, this is not good, right? This is kind of scary, in fact. And Truman he tends to agree with Churchill, right? Now, remember, Truman's a very interesting character. We talked about him quite a bit before break, so I don't feel the need to hammer those points home again. But Truman definitely sides with Churchill here. Whereas again, Roosevelt, before Truman, Roosevelt a little bit more of a pragmatist. He was a little bit more of a tinkerer. He certainly was on good terms with all of these guys, but he was on those kind of terms because he saw the need for sort of he saw the need for positive relations with a wide swath of people, right? Um, so he's not going to buy into Churchill's rhetoric as hook, line, and sinker as, say, a Harry S. Truman is. Now, as I completely misplace my technology wiles, the Truman Doctrine, then. So, what Truman does with the help of a number of his advisors is he comes up with this thing called the Truman Doctrine. Now, this is notable for a couple of reasons. Um, First of all, the definition, it says that we, the United States, are going to help any nation struggling against communism. Okay. And when we say help, you can see that here. It's money. We're talking about money here, right? We're not talking about direct military intervention. We're talking about cash, right? And it's struggling against communism. We are now directly at odds. We're directly butting heads with Stalin and the Soviet Union. Now, the longer term impact, though, is this is very much an extension of that thing we called the Roosevelt Corollary, which, if you remember, the Roosevelt Corollary was just this is not FDR, not Franklin Roosevelt, but Theodore Roosevelt back at the turn of the century. So some 40 years earlier, that said, you know what, we have the ability and we have the right, actually, as the United States to intervene in any country in the Western Hemisphere that maybe isn't doing what they need to do to keep European nations out of the Western Hemisphere. Well, now we're not contained to our hemisphere anymore. This is any nation that is, quote, fighting or struggling against communism, which is really it's really an ambiguous definition, to say the least, right? So we have the Truman Doctrine. Now, right alongside with the Truman Doctrine is this thing called containment. Okay, and this is George Kennan. George Kennan's a fascinating guy. A lot of these guys are fascinating. Kennan, though, more than most. If you're interested in this stuff at all, research George Kennan. Look up this thing called the Long Telegram. He is sort of the Soviet expert, right? It says that he's a guru, right? And he argues for this thing called containment, where he basically says, look, the nature of the Soviet, the nature of the Soviet ideology is to expand. So in order to defeat that ideology, we have to contain it. We have to keep it from expanding. Okay. Now he argues for a number of different ways of doing this. And the question that's put there is that was this successful? And it's a little bit mixed as to whether or not it was successful or not, right? And we'll talk about that sort of answer to that question here in a minute, right? So how do we contain communism? And I put this out there in a previous iteration of this, is that how do you contain an idea? And I want you to write about that in your 3-2-1, right? Either in the context of the Marshall Plan, or maybe you have your own thoughts on this. But I want you to pick. I want you to use this as one of the things that you learned, again, the Marshall Plan, or one of the things that surprised you. Write something in your 3-2-1 about how do you contain an idea, right? Dan Carlin uses this phrase, intellectual contagion, right? Which is kind of ironic that I would throw that phrase out there, given the current state of our state, our nation, and our world, right? Is we're fighting this contagion. But I want you to think about that. How do you fight an idea, right? Because that's what we're trying to do here in this containment doctrine. How do you contain communism? Well, how do you contain any idea? Secretary of State George Marshall, his idea is the Marshall Plan, and that's money. We're going to use money to contain communism. So the Marshall Plan is this $13 billion worth of financial aid that is to go to Western Europe, right? Now it hinges on this. We're going to give you this money so long as you are a democracy, you allow free elections, you observe human rights. That's something that's a totally different subject that I wish we had more time to get into, but we just don't. But you're going to observe basic human rights. You're not going to become communist, hint, hint, wink, wink. You're going to be a free market economy. So it's this $13 billion worth of aid that is offered to these Western Europe nations, but it's got all these strings attached to it, right? We offer it to Stalin. We say, hey, look, Soviet Union, you guys can have a piece of this. You just got to play by the rules that everybody else does, and you can probably figure out what Stalin says, right? But that's Marshall's idea of, okay, well, this is how we're going to contain this very dangerous idea, right? So that's what I want you to write about that in your 3-2-1 somewhere, not your question. Please don't make that your question. But I want you to think about that, either something that you learned in terms of the Marshall Plan here, or maybe if you have a different idea, maybe this surprises you that we would just throw money at the problem. I just want you to take, I'm giving you one of your 5 things that you sort of have to write about. And that's the one that I want to make sure that you write about. Now, Stalin's pushback, because the Marshall Plan really starts this doctrine of containment. And Stalin realizes pretty quickly that he's got a problem. So in West Berlin, which it says there is Allied control, remember West Berlin is that section of Berlin that's controlled by jointly the United States, Britain, and France, right? The democracies, you can just call them the democracies. And in the west side of Berlin, the side that's controlled by the democracies, things are really pretty good. There's plenty of food. There's plenty of supplies. There's education is out there and available in abundance. There's technological innovations. Things are good. In East Berlin, which again is just like the rest of Eastern Germany, it's controlled by the Soviet Union. Things are awful. There's shortages all the time. There's limited water supply. There's higher unemployment. Like things are just terrible. And this is a bad look, right? Because if you're Stalin, you've got East Berlin is right next to West Berlin, and things are great over there. Things are really terrible here. So what Stalin decides is, all right, we're going to cut West Berlin off from the rest of the modern world. He institutes a blockade. And what he's essentially trying to do is he's trying to bring Western Berlin to its knees, right? And basically trying to put them, make them kind of suffer through the same things that East Berlin is going through. And it's effective for a little while, and I don't know how long this is at this point, but I will play from Rocky. Oh, I've got my... Here, I'll play it again. And that's Rocky, by the way. I think that's Rocky 4. He's trying to break the West, right? And he's hoping that eventually the West will just give up and say, hey, you know what? Western Berlin, you guys go ahead and take it. We're okay here with just West Germany. That's what Stalin's hoping for, right? Now, what actually ended up happening, though, is this. He had kind of forgotten about a way, because it's blockade, right? You can't drive through East Berlin or East Germany. So if you're in West Berlin, you're stuck. You can't go in and out. You can't get supplies, right? And if you try to break the blockade, right? Because the question might be, well, why don't we just attack them? Well, if we attack them, then we're going to start World War III, right? And that's something that I'll just sort of take a pause here and sort of zoom out a little bit from this. And why don't we do anything? Well, you got to remember, so we were the only country that had the atomic bomb, right? That thing that we dropped on Japan to end the war in the Pacific. We were the only ones that had it. And when we're the only ones that had it, man, that's a lot of power, right? And the Soviets, especially, are concerned. Oh, the Americans have got this weapon. We don't have anything like that. What are we going to do? We can't possibly go toe to toe with them. The problem is that um, by the time we get to the blockade of Berlin and then the Berlin airlift, which we're going to talk about here in a minute, the Soviets also have the bomb, right? Or we're at least pretty sure that they do. I believe they test their first atomic bomb in 1950. And again, the dates, I'm not entirely sure of the dates on all this, but we're pretty sure that if they don't have the bomb yet, they're getting pretty close, right? So it's not just as simple as, oh, we've got the atomic bomb, so you want to blockade, West Berlin? Okay, well, let's see how you like this. Well, you can't do that because, well, what if they have one of those too, right? And we're going to talk about that um, in the coming weeks, but that's one of those things. And that was another reason, too, why Stalin really, I mentioned it earlier, very distrusting of Truman, even because he says, look, you guys had this weapon. You didn't tell us about it. And again, to be sure, like he knew. I mean, these guys knew. This is the era of spies and all that kind of stuff. So I just kind of wanted to zoom out a little bit here for a second and just sort of reset us. So, well, why didn't we just attack them? Well, because we don't want to. We're afraid of what World War III might look like, right? And we're going to talk about that more as we move forward. So again, back to the Berlin airlift. What the Allies decide to do, U.S. and the British especially, is they're going to fly planes, cargo planes, over West Berlin. They're going to drop supplies. This is called the Berlin airlift. Now, again, why don't the Soviets just shoot down a plane? Well, it's the same way. The Soviets don't want to be the one to start any kind of conflict either, right? So these planes are I mean, once they're over Berlin airspace is not something that's like a terribly, concrete idea yet. We're still pretty early on into the use of aircraft for warfare purposes. So this Berlin airlift thing actually makes a lot of sense, right? Um, so the Berlin airlift um, breaks Stalin's hold on West Berlin, and we talked about that. Technically Stalin hasn't done anything wrong. That's the other thing. He's issuing a blockade. Um, and we're not going to get into supporting people yet. Although China is a really big deal. China falls to communism. Why is this such a big deal? China falling to communism? Well, because they're a huge trading partner going back to the late 1890s, and they're now controlled essentially by the Russians, by the Soviet. And you can see the numbers there. When you put the Soviet Union and China together, you're talking about a quarter of the world's landmass, 25%, and a third of the world's population. That's a lot of people, right? It also borders the Korean Peninsula, and this is where we're going to get into the Korean War. I mentioned this earlier. The Cold War is the Cold War because the United States and the Soviet Union never actually meet each other head to head on the battlefield, right? You have some what we call, quote, hot spots here and there, and the Korean conflict, because it is technically not a war. It was never a declared war. It is technically a conflict. But if you talk to guys like my grandpa, or maybe some of your grandfathers or your great grandfathers who fought in Korea, they'll tell you it was a war. Like, you can call it a conflict all you want, but at the end of the day, it's a war, right? Korea is about as close as we actually get um, to a full blown, um, actual war, declared war as we know it between the United States and Great Britain. So one of the things that I wanted to set this up because we are going to talk about Korea on Wednesday. Is kind of going to be the bulk of what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about a couple other things too, but I want the bulk of it to be about the Korean War. Yes, Kim. Yeah, okay. The thing that we're going to talk about on Wednesday is PTSD. So Wednesday, when we have what we're going to do on Wednesdays, we're going to try a Google Hangout. There will be a link posted on Classroom where you'll join the Hangout at the appropriate time. I don't remember now. I want to say I'm not even going to give a time. I know that there's an established time that the school has, but it'll be an established time that we'll meet together on a hangout and again, my plan is not to take the whole hour. Um, this first one will probably be a little bit longer just because I'm going to go over some ground rules and things like that for how the hangouts need to work in order for them to work efficiently. But once we sort of get through the ground rules and get through some of the technical glitchy type stuff, then we're going to watch a video clip, and then we're going to talk about PTSD. We're going to talk about the Korean War a little bit on Wednesday. So you've got a 3-2-1 over this lecture. I've given you a lot of stuff to write about, including the one thing that I asked you to write about there, roughly in the middle, maybe middle to the end of the lecture. So make sure you put something in there on that subject. That'll be due the next Monday, right? I don't have the dates in front of me. I think that next Monday is maybe April 5th or 6th, something like that. I could be completely off on that. It might even be the 7th. But you'll have a full week to get that done. If you've got any questions at all, feel free to reach out to me. Again, email is probably the best way to get in touch with me, but I'm here to answer your questions. We're going to do the best we can. Like I said, sort of in that short little explainer video I posted. We'll get through this. It'll be okay. But just know that I'm here to help you guys. Your other teachers are here to help you. We love all of you. Otherwise, we wouldn't be doing this job, period, to begin with, let alone putting in all this time that we're putting in trying to get things figured out. And so let's just kind of make the best of it. So with that being said, I'll see a lot of you. I'll see as many of you as I can, hopefully, on Wednesday, and we can talk about the Korean War.